Hi class, I'm going to spend a little bit in this video talking about some of the concepts involved in looking at children and families and the intersection with immigration enforcement practices in the United States. I'm not going to be able to get into in depth all of the concepts that we talk about in this week's course readings, but I do want to define a couple of things, clarify a couple of things, and help deepen maybe a couple of concepts for those of you who are not super familiar with this topic as you look at the readings in order to get a little bit more meaning out of them. So first I want to talk about two different concepts of family separation in immigration involvement. So immigration or migration, leaving one's country of origin for another country, inherently involves family separation, how it has always looked throughout history. There is a natural byproduct, so to speak, of migration, where oftentimes some family members are left behind in pursuit of the destination country. This is more a matter of circumstance of migration, right? For child welfare considerations and family functioning considerations, we need to look at the attachment impacts of that. We need to look at the clinical effects of families in countries of origin, about being separated from family members. But there is a sense that this is a voluntary process, at least for the person who has migrated or who has left, and generally implies that there has been a family decision-making process involved in the decision to have left one's country of origin. This is very different from when there are circumstances that look at forced migration, where the departure is involuntary. Whether that's because of conflict or strife or persecution in country of origin that kind of limits the choices and the decision making a particular family has about the decision to leave, or whether that's because of state decision making or state law enforcement. So I separate that out from kind of traditional family separation as a consequence of migration and forced family separation as a consequence of state decision making. I want to define a concept called transnational families. These are families that organize life decisions across national boundaries. This can be two national boundaries, this can be multiple national boundaries, but the idea is that families have the capacity for organizing themselves and making decisions, being responsible to more than one country at a time. This can look like families that certain members have left and gone to another country, and yet they continue to participate in family life. They continue to support one another economically, make custody decisions, make decisions about returning to countries of origin or kind of how to organize childcare. This can also be a result of forced family separation as a result of families needing to make these decisions. But it does look at the fact that families truly do have the ability to navigate multiple social norms at the same time, multiple legal and kind of national expectations at the same time, and to be able to use that as a strength is very important for families that are living divided between more than one country. I do want to highlight some of the challenges for transnational families that often result from reunification after long periods of separation. Some of you may already work with immigrant families in your communities and so may be familiar with some of the challenges around reunification. Oftentimes, parents who have migrated first and then later bring their children to reunify with them in the United States, or who send for their children, may have an opportunity to reunify with them. And so we often see challenges with reunifications, particularly with older children or teenagers. And this is often a result of kind of the child has been raised by another family member in the country of origin, or may have experienced trauma in the country of origin or on their journey here. The parent has kind of solidified their view as parent, but the child may not necessarily see or understand that same role because that parent was not present. We also see challenges with attachment issues after having experienced perceived abandonment as a result of migration. And so sometimes these, among other clinical issues, get in the way of family members being able to bond appropriately, and so they have to kind of work through a lot of these challenges in reunification in order to avoid any kind of placement breakdown. Placement breakdowns refer to either a reunification that has been challenged by trauma or by kind of post-honeymoon adjustment to being together again after many years, or also times when children are living with other family members in the United States and are not able to adjust to either their expectations, or it's an unsafe situation for the child and the child needs to find another placement. And so sometimes these families require obviously a lot more intervention from social workers in the community organizations, and there's also a greater risk of some of these children falling through the cracks when they are not involved with formal social service systems, they can be kind of invisible in communities if they're not being enrolled in school or they're not being, having medical care access and things like that. So being aware of some of the challenges around family reunifications and placement breakdowns is very important, because they're often spaces where the child welfare system is not present, and often in situations where people are trying to kind of keep a low profile because of their legal situation, and then the resulting issues on children are really dangerous. So it's important to kind of keep an eye out for that when you're working with families that have been reunified, just to make sure that they're safe and appropriate reunifications. Families who have formal child welfare system involvement, and who are at risk of return, or who have been returned to their country of origin, are at particular risk of losing parental rights. This is because of the challenges in the public child welfare system and the court system in understanding and navigating other countries' child welfare systems, and also not always consistently facilitating participation of parents once they have been ordered to leave the country, either through deportation or voluntary return, or some other situation when they've had to leave the country and their child is already involved in the child welfare system. Some states have seen cases over the years of children entering the child welfare system as a result of immigration enforcement. The immigration enforcement system has tried to work with non-governmental organizations to put protections in place to ensure that parents do understand their parental rights when they are detained by immigration officials. But this is a real challenge in getting both systems to work together in order to protect parental rights of immigrants and ensure that children are not placed into the child welfare system simply as a result of immigration enforcement, with no ability for that parent to reunify with their child or participate meaningfully in the reunification procedures. This also applies to people who have children already involved in the child welfare system, and parents need to be able to continue participating in their reunification planning process, even if they have returned to their country of origin. So there's a lot of complicated factors involved in that, and a lot of ethnocentrism that goes into the decision making of judges and caseworkers and people involved in the system to be able to kind of advocate for parents to be able to reunify with their children, even if it means sending them to another country. So these are just things that you should be aware of, maybe look into a little bit further as you study these topics, but I just want to highlight them as challenges. I'm not going to be able to get into them very in-depth in this video because I'm trying to keep it brief, but there are things that you should be aware of as child welfare impacts of immigration enforcement and families. So I want to talk a little bit more about forced family separation as a result of immigration enforcement policy in the U.S. The thing to keep in mind about immigration enforcement is that the policies are built on the idea of suffering as a deterrent for violating U.S. immigration laws. And that may sound harsh, but it is truly the kind of foundation of the idea that if people suffer, then they will not violate immigration laws. And this is particularly true around border enforcement, that without going too much into the history of border enforcement and the U.S.-Mexico border in particular, our policies and decisions about where to tighten gaps in the U.S.-Mexico border and how to apply, you know, workforce and technology is intended to kind of push people into the most harsh conditions as possible, knowing that if people started to die as a result of those harsh conditions, or people experienced more suffering, that could be a deterrent for people crossing into the U.S. without authorization. And that was the specific intent of many kind of foundational pieces of border enforcement over the last 25 years. And those impacts and those intents of the government filter through much of the immigration enforcement policy decision making beyond the U.S.-Mexico border and into the interior. And that same sense of intent of inflicting suffering and punishing people for having entered the country without authorization goes into much of the decision making around how to use technology, you know, when and where to do raids, kind of whether or not children and families are taken into consideration when immigration laws are being applied, you know, programs that have come and gone throughout history, such as Secure Communities and 287G agreements, which involve police participation with federal immigration enforcement officers. All of those different programs cause suffering and are a byproduct of application of the law above all other human interest. It's important also to understand that U.S. citizen children or spouses are not enough reason to keep families together in the eyes of the law. There are a lot of misconceptions about kind of, oh, people can just have children and then they'll be able to stay, or people can just marry a U.S. citizen and they'll be able to stay. But the reality is the law is much more complicated that for people in different types of legal situations. And the presence of mixed status families, or families that have more than one type of immigration status within that family unit, are very much the reality for millions of families in this country. And that leads to a lot of uncertainty, a lot of limbo as kind of cases are held up in courts and decision making is halted while the government kind of decides on people's future. U.S. citizen children may need to return to countries of origin of their family members, or U.S. citizen spouses may be forced to uproot as a result of immigration enforcement policy in order to stay with family members in if they are forced to return as a result of deportation. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that even mixed status families or families where there are U.S. citizens also part of the same family, that they're also impacted by immigration enforcement. And that immigration enforcement, and we're looking at immigrant families, there is that mixed status families are often more prevalent than quote unquote kind of pure immigrant families, for lack of a better word, where everybody is an immigrant. Eventually, children are born here, people marry, certain people may be eligible for certain types of immigration relief and other people not, and things get very messy and very mixed up pretty quickly. And so it's important to kind of be aware of some of those issues and aware that situations for families are way more complex than we maybe realize. There's also been a kind of common thread throughout discourse around whether or not people deserve, quote unquote, to be citizens just as a result of having been born here. And so that's something that we often need to fight against in order to kind of protect the rights of children who are born in this country, even to parents who have not been born in this country. And that kind of discrimination is still very present today. Immigration enforcement in the interior. So this is where ICE gets involved, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is an arm of Department of Homeland Security. This is where we see things like raids, people being detained, people being put into removal or deportation proceedings, people being formally deported from the country. Where families are involved, often when families are at risk of being impacted by internal immigration enforcement policy, it's important for us to be talking with families about family safety planning. So making custody decisions, coming up with power of attorney letters, making decisions about whether or not their children are going to reunify with them in their country of origin, how to make that happen, how to prepare the proper documents for return to country of origin, especially if children need to become dual nationals, how to get passports, how to make sure that people know how to contact you in your country of origin, if you have to return prior to the child going with you, authorizing people to take care of your children in your absence, finding ways to ensure that you're protecting parental rights, even if you will not be able to be there. There's a lot of considerations for families to take as they're preparing for the possibility of immigration enforcement. And this is definitely where social workers need to come in communities to be able to talk about these issues with families, as well as the clinical issues of dealing with the stress and the anxiety around being involved in immigration removal proceedings, or dealing with kind of the climate of fear around living without authorization in the country. So some of the readings are going to talk about the consequences. I think one of the videos is going to talk about the consequences of the zero tolerance policy by Jeff Sessions in 2018. So this policy was one in which that referred specifically to border enforcement, and claimed that there would be zero tolerance for people entering the country without authorization, even if they were seeking asylum. And so this applied specifically to most people coming from Central America during 2018 and the beginnings of 2019. And this was a policy where the U.S. government arrested all of the adults coming into the country, even if they were coming with children. And those with children, so they would arrest the adults, place them in criminal proceedings, and then separate the children and place them into the system for unaccompanied children through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which I will describe in a few minutes. And the adults would go into criminal proceedings, and then after they would go through the criminal proceedings, then they would be kind of filtered back into the U.S. immigration enforcement system and either, placed in removal proceedings or formally deported, depending on kind of the circumstances of their particular case. And obviously this created a lot of scandal in the U.S. because reunification procedures were very unclear. People became aware of the inappropriate and illegal custody conditions for children and families, particularly at the border. People became aware of parents who were deported with children still in custody, with no kind of mechanism in place to ensure that they'd be able to be reunified quickly or safely. And I emphasize that people became aware because some of these practices of, number one, placing people in criminal proceedings upon entering the country without authorization as a deterrent for unauthorized entry, and also family separation at the border, has been happening for a long time, but not necessarily as a matter of policy, and not necessarily to the degree and with the intensity that it became in practice in 2018. But it is important to know that the mechanisms on which those policies were built have been in existence for a much longer time, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to learn more about some of that as you go. But all in all, over 5,000 children were separated from their parents during this period in 2018, and we're still kind of living out the consequences. There are legal decisions coming out all the time about kind of the responsibility of the government to provide mental health care to families who were impacted by that particular policy and who were separated indefinitely. Organizations throughout the country are still working with families who have been able to reunify and come back to the U.S. to claim asylum and go through their immigration court proceedings. Different kinds of impacts we're still seeing in kind of the wake of that policy. So unaccompanied children refer to children who are apprehended by U.S. immigration enforcement authorities and who are found to be without a parent or guardian at the time of their arrest. So this is important because there is a separate, though connected, federal child welfare system that applies specifically to working with unaccompanied children. And some of you may have experience working with the system or aware of this system in your jurisdictions. But it's important to understand because it's a kind of parallel child welfare system that many people are not aware of. So what's important to understand is that when children who are found to be without a parent or guardian who are traveling into the United States and they are from what's called a non-contiguous country, so countries other than Mexico and Canada, they are not able to be held for longer than 72 hours at the border or in ICE custody. So they're transferred to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services. Children are, upon arrest, they're placed in immigration removal proceedings, so they're placed in deportation proceedings because U.S. immigration policy applies the exact same way to children as it does to adults. So when children are arrested, they're placed in immigration removal proceedings, and then they're transferred to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where they're placed in a network of shelters and housing facilities throughout the country, where staff then work with the child to identify whether or not there are options for reunification with family members in their place, their destination where they were headed. And then they begin to screen for the safety and appropriateness of placement with those family members. So family members will then be contacted to sponsor a child, even if it is their blood relative or their own child, if it's a parent. They submit a whole slew of paperwork, identifying documents, financial information, kind of proof of criminal background check, all of these different kinds of things, in order to sponsor a child for them to be released to their custody in the community while they continue their immigration court proceedings. So family members or sponsors, they tell the government that they will, ensure that the child is enrolled in school, get them medical care, find them legal representation, and ensure that they attend their court proceedings while they go through those procedures. What's important to understand is that there has been a long history over the last 15 years or so of kind of the degree to which the system of the Office of Refugee Resettlement screens and ensures the safety and appropriateness of placements, even with immediate family members. And this is a complicated issue where child advocates and legal advocates have sometimes been at odds around kind of the ethical standards involved in detaining children because they came without authorization and because they came without accompaniment, and also ensuring that they are being protected and that they're being turned over to appropriate and safe adult individuals that are going to care for them. The law around how this process flows is built into the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that's important because it has been recognized that children are at risk of trafficking as a result of some of the smuggling activities that go on to get children here, and that not all children are being brought to the U.S. because they are, reunifying with families, but some are at risk of entering into trafficking situations. However, we also know that a great majority of children are reunifying with some family member. And so how do you balance out the child welfare protections to ensure their safety and the appropriateness of placements, as well as kind of family rights and the ability for children to reunify, taking into account the complexity of the system and the complexity and danger involved in migration itself and bringing children to the U.S. And so it's important to kind of take into account some of those complexities while then also remembering all of the other stuff that we know about. How do we support families through reunifications? How do we work with them to understand how to access their legal rights to claim children out of the system and get them to the community so that they're not detained longer than is necessary for their own well-being? So working with this population, we need to be able to juggle with a lot of complexities and work through a lot of different intersecting systems in order to kind of individualize the attention to each family to say, what is it that you need in this instance? What kinds of services and supports in the communities can we put in place to ensure that this placement is successful? And then also kind of help you through the process of navigating your immigration court involvement. If a child does not have any viable adult family member or sponsor available to take them, they could be transferred into a federal foster care program, which many organizations throughout the country participate in to find foster placements and kind of take care of children long term and kind of transfer them into permanency options that would apply to them even if they were not born here and they have the opportunity for legal relief as a result of their kind of abandonment or inability to reunify with any particular adult. Family detention is also something that you may have heard about quite a bit in recent years. And this is important to understand that there has been an evolution of policy around family detention as a reaction to changing flows of migration of people coming into the United States. The article in one of your readings, there's an article called Locking Up Family Values. This talks about the history of activism around family detention. So it's important to kind of pay attention to that because it is something that is still very current, and the ways that we detain family members coming into the country are very antithetical to a lot of what we as social workers would understand as family rights. There have been concerns about the quality and conditions of detention centers, so whether families have access to lawyers, the conditions for children, how long they're detained, what is the impact on their mental health, and what are the practices around safe release in communities? How are people being released from facilities? What information are they being given? How are they traveling? How are they able to get to where they need to go safely? The response of the government as pressure to release families have been intensive supervision programs in communities of destination. So, intense monitoring, check-ins with immigration officials or subcontractors of immigration officials, and electronic monitoring. So ankle bracelets, GPS trackers, etc. There was a Flores settlement. The Flores settlement was a lawsuit many years ago around the quality and standards that have to be in place in facilities that house children through these systems. And so the Flores settlement applies traditionally to facilities that house unaccompanied children, but legal advocates have done a lot of work to get the government to recognize that the Flores settlement also applies to detention facilities that house children with their parents, so family detention facilities. And so there have been a lot of lawsuits around how to apply the Flores settlement to family detention facilities. In short-term detention facilities at the border in particular, where there's overcrowding or overflow while they wait for space, either in family detention facilities or are waiting for release to communities, there have been a lot of concerns about access to doctors and the physical health and conditions of children in short-term custody. And we've seen multiple child deaths this year of children who have come into the country or who are waiting for kind of a decision around asylum or access to be able to enter the country with their parents, and multiple children have died as a result. So those are some of the concepts that I wanted to review with you. Please enjoy the readings this week, as heavy as they may be. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to let me know.